Lieutenant Daniel Cross had been a hostage negotiator for 7 years, specializing in the increasingly complex landscape of human-alien interactions that characterized life on multi-species stations like Unity Station where he worked. It was delicate, dangerous work that required him to understand alien psychology, cultural contexts that made certain demands reasonable or unreasonable by different species standards, and how to de-escalate situations where species differences created misunderstandings that turned violent faster than anyone intended. He was good at his job. He talked down 17 potentially lethal situations without losing a single hostage. He understood that most hostage takers weren't actually monsters. They were desperate people in impossible situations making terrible choices because they couldn't see better options. His job was to show them those better options, to be the calm, rational voice that helped them step back from the edge they'd walked themselves onto. He'd never encountered anyone quite like Vexara. She was Kethron, warrior species known across human-occupied space for their formidable combat capabilities, their rigid code of honor, and their extremely hierarchical social structure. The Kethron had only been in regular contact with humanity for about 15 years, and relations were still sometimes tense, complicated by cultural misunderstandings, and the Kethron tendency to respond to perceived insults with immediate violence. Vexara was holding 3 humans hostage in Cargo Bay 7. She'd taken them during their shift, barricaded the bay's entrances, and was making demands that station security found both unreasonable and unclear. Something about her brother, about justice, about human lives and Kethron honor. Daniel got the call at 400 station time. Hostage situation, armed Kethron female, 3 civilians in danger, negotiator needed immediately. He was at the cargo bay within 10 minutes, reviewing what little information security had managed to gather while he prepared for insertion. "What do we know about her?" Daniel asked the security commander who'd established perimeter outside the bay. Vexara, 27 standard years old, Kethron age equivalent of mid-20s, worked maintenance on the station for 2 years. Her brother died 3 months ago in equipment accident, pressure seal failure in Section 14. Investigation ruled it accidental, case closed. She's been increasingly agitated since then, filing complaints, demanding investigation be reopened, claiming it was murder covered up by humans. The commander pulled up relevant files on his datapad. "We dismissed her complaints as grief-driven paranoia. Apparently we were wrong about how dangerous that grief would become." "What are her specific demands?" Daniel asked, already mentally preparing his approach. "That's the problem. They're not entirely clear. Something about reopening investigation into her brother's death, about humans being punished for murdering him, about Kethron honor requiring justice. But she's not demanding transport off station or money or the usual hostage situation asks. She wants acknowledgement and action on a case we consider closed. That's hard to negotiate." "I'll talk to her," Daniel decided. "Get me inside. I go in unarmed, visible camera feed so you can monitor, and nobody moves unless I give distress signal." "Understood." "You sure about this? Kethron are dangerous even unarmed, and she's definitely armed. If she decides you're another lying human, she could kill you before we could intervene." "That's always the risk," Daniel said calmly. "But it's my risk to take, that's the job." They got him inside through secondary access point that Vexara hadn't barricaded. Daniel approached the main cargo area with his hands clearly visible, moving slowly, his body language deliberately non-threatening. He'd studied Kethron customs extensively, knew that direct eye contact was respectful rather than challenging for them, that showing fear would trigger their predator instincts, that they valued honesty and directness over diplomatic hedging. Vexara was exactly as terrifying as Daniel had expected. Tall even by Kethron standards, nearly 7 feet, with the muscular build and natural grace that characterized her species. Her skin had the slightly scaled texture and dark coloring that marked her as coming from one of the southern regions of the Kethron homeworld. She wore practical maintenance workers' clothing, but she'd added traditional Kethron warrior markers, armbands that denoted family honor, blade strapped to her thigh that was both weapon and symbol of her status as adult Kethron with right to defend herself. The three hostages were huddled together near some cargo containers, clearly terrified but apparently unharmed. Vexara stood between them and the entrance, weapon in hand, her posture radiating barely controlled violence. "Another human come to lie to me," she said when she saw Daniel, her voice carrying the slight harmonic overtone that Kethron vocal structures produced. "Leave before I add you to my prisoners, negotiator." "I'm Lieutenant Daniel Cross," he said calmly, stopping at what he judged was respectful distance. "I'm here to listen to you, to understand what you need, to find solution that doesn't end with anyone dying today. That's all I want. Will you talk to me? What I need is justice." Vexara's voice rose with barely suppressed rage and grief. "My brother was murdered by humans who then covered it up with false accident report. Your security refuses to investigate properly. Your justice system dismissed my evidence without real consideration, so I will force you to care by making this everyone's problem instead of just mine." "Tell me about your brother," Daniel said, carefully sitting down on a cargo container to make himself less threatening through height differential. "Tell me what happened. I promise I'll listen, actually listen, not just wait for you to stop talking so I can dismiss your concerns like apparently everyone else has." Vexara stared at him suspiciously, but something in his tone or body language must have convinced her he was sincere, because she started talking. Her brother's name was Kethvar. He'd been 3 years younger, which in Kethron culture meant she was responsible for his safety and well-being. They'd come to Unity Station together seeking work opportunities that were scarce on their overcrowded homeworld. Kethvar had gotten position in maintenance, good work, decent pay, chance to build future in human space where opportunities for Kethron were generally better than at home. Then, 3 months ago, he died. Equipment failure in the section he was maintaining. Pressure seal that should have been secure suddenly failed catastrophically, causing explosive decompression that killed him instantly. The investigation was quick, conclusive. Faulty equipment, tragic accident, no one to blame. Case closed within a week, but Vexara insisted it was an accident. She had evidence, messages her brother had received threatening him, testimony from other Kethron workers who'd witnessed human coworkers harassing him for taking human jobs, documentation showing the equipment had been inspected and certified as safe just days before it failed. She brought all of this to station security, demanded proper investigation, insisted her brother had been murdered. Security dismissed her concerns, said the threatening messages were just workplace conflicts that hadn't risen to actionable level, said witness testimony about harassment was vague and didn't prove murder, said equipment inspections weren't foolproof and failures happened despite precautions, said reopening investigation based on sister's grief-driven suspicions wasn't justified by available evidence. "So I had no choice," Vexara said, and her voice was raw with pain and rage. "If your justice system won't give me justice through proper channels, I will force justice through any means necessary. Kethron honor demands I defend my brother's memory. I will not fail him in death as I apparently failed him in life by not protecting him from your murderous species." Daniel listened to all of it. Didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss, didn't immediately jump to defending station security's decisions. Just listened with focused attention that communicated he was taking her seriously. "I understand your grief," he said when she finished, "and your frustration with system that seems designed to deny you answers. Losing family is devastating, and having that loss dismissed or minimized makes it infinitely worse. You deserve to have your brother's death investigated thoroughly. You deserve answers. You deserve justice if murder occurred." "But," Vexara said bitterly, "I hear but coming. But taking hostages won't get you justice, Daniel continued gently. It'll get you arrested or killed, and your brother's death will remain unresolved. You'll have sacrificed yourself without achieving anything except confirming human biases about Kethron being violent. Your brother wouldn't want that for you. My brother is dead. Vexara's weapon trembled in her hand. What he wants doesn't matter anymore. What matters is honor. I cannot let his murder go unanswered. If I die seeking justice for him, at least I die with honor intact. Better that than live knowing I did nothing, while humans murdered my brother and covered it up. They talked for hours, Daniel slowly, carefully building rapport, demonstrating through his patient attention and thoughtful responses that he genuinely cared about understanding her perspective, acknowledging her grief without dismissing her anger, validating that the system had failed her while trying to show her that destroying herself wouldn't fix that failure. Vexara gradually responded to his approach. Let him bring water to the hostages when they asked. Discussed with him what justice would actually look like, not just punishment, but acknowledgement, proper investigation, answers about what really happened. Began to trust slightly that maybe this human was different from the ones who dismissed her. But she was also deteriorating. Hours of tension, sleep deprivation from days of planning this, grief she'd been holding back since her brother's death, all of it was eroding her control. Her hands shook increasingly when she held her weapon. Her responses became more volatile. She was reaching breaking point. When one of the hostages made sudden movement, just shifting position because his leg had fallen asleep, nothing threatening, Vexara reacted on pure instinct. Weapon up, pointed at his head, finger on trigger, all that carefully built rapport vanishing under wave of startled adrenaline. "Don't move," she screamed. "Nobody moves or I start killing people. I'm done being patient. I'm done waiting for humans to care. Someone dies right now unless I get answers." Daniel moved, deliberately, putting himself between Vexara and the hostage, standing directly in her line of fire with his hands raised but his posture calm, non-threatening. "You don't want to kill anyone," he said quietly. "That won't bring your brother back. That won't get you justice. That'll just make you murderer, and you're not murderer, Vexara. You're grieving sister seeking justice for brother you loved. Don't destroy yourself pursuing it. Get out of my way." The weapon was pointed at Daniel's chest now, trembling badly in her shaking hands. "Move or I shoot through you to reach them." "No," Daniel held her gaze steadily. "You'll have to shoot me first, and I don't think you actually want to do that. I think you're in pain and desperate and you've been backed into corner by systems that failed you. But I don't think you're killer. I think you're hurting. I just want justice." Vexara was crying now, tears streaming down her face, while she kept the weapon pointed at Daniel with hands that shook so badly he genuinely wasn't sure if she'd shoot him accidentally, even if she didn't mean to. "Why is that so hard? Why does nobody care that my brother is dead? Why am I the only one who thinks his life mattered?" "I care," Daniel said, and slowly, carefully, deliberately, he reached out and touched her arm, the one holding the weapon. Just gentle contact, his hand resting over hers where she gripped the weapon aimed at his chest. "I care about your brother. I care about you. We're going to find answers. I promise you that, but not like this, not by destroying yourself. Your brother loved you. You said he did. He wouldn't want you to die or become killer in his name. He'd want you to live, to heal, to honor his memory by living well. Let me help you do that." "One more touch and I'll kill you," Vexara whispered, but she didn't pull away from his hand on her arm. Didn't shoot. Just stood there with weapon pointed at his chest while tears continued falling and her whole body shook with suppressed emotion. Daniel smiled, small, sad, infinitely compassionate smile, and deliberately touched her again. This time on her shoulder, above where he was still touching her weapon arm. A gesture of comfort and support and absolute trust that she wouldn't actually shoot him. "Then I guess you'll have to kill me," he said quietly, "because I'm not going to let you destroy yourself like this. Your brother wouldn't want it. I don't want it. You deserve better than dying or becoming killer." You deserve justice and healing and future where his memory brings you peace instead of pain. So if you need to shoot me to preserve your threat, then do it. But I'm not moving. I'm not abandoning you. I'm not going to stop touching you just because you're hurting and scared and threatening violence. I'm staying right here, touching you, caring about you, until you decide to put the weapon down and let me actually help you. Vexara broke. The weapon dropped from her hands, just fell to the floor with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. And she collapsed forward, and Daniel caught her, his arms going around her as she fell against him, sobbing with the kind of deep, wrenching grief that came from months of holding everything together and finally having permission to fall apart. He held her while she cried, held her while station security cautiously entered and secured the hostages, while medical personnel checked everyone for injuries, while his commander waited impatiently for him to extract himself from the situation so they could arrest her properly. But Daniel just held her, let her cry against his chest, stroked her back in gesture of comfort while she trembled and sobbed and released all the pain she'd been holding. Because this, he understood, was the actual negotiation. Not the words, not the standoff, but this moment where she trusted him enough to be vulnerable, to stop being warrior and just be sister who'd lost her brother and didn't know how to cope with that loss. When she finally quieted, still leaning against him but no longer actively crying, Daniel spoke softly. "I meant what I said. We'll investigate your brother's death properly. I'll make sure it happens. You'll get answers, and you'll get through this. I promise." "Why?" Vexara asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Why do you care? You're human. My brother was Kethron. Why does his death matter to you?" "Because you matter to me," Daniel said honestly. "Because in the last several hours, watching you hurt, listening to your grief, understanding what drove you to this desperate action, I've come to care about what happens to you. And your brother mattered to you, which means he matters to me. That's how caring works. It expands to include what the people we care about care about." Vexara pulled back slightly to look at him, her face wet with tears, her expression confused and vulnerable in ways that made her look younger than her years. "You're insane," she said. "I could have killed you, would have killed you if you'd been wrong about me." "But I wasn't wrong," Daniel pointed out gently. "And even if I had been, it would have been worth the risk. Saving lives, yours included, is worth risking mine. That's what makes us different from people who value power over people. We're willing to be vulnerable to create connection. And look, it worked. Everyone's safe, including you. Now we figure out next steps." Those next steps included Vexara's arrest, naturally. But they also included Daniel testifying on her behalf, explaining the grief and systemic failure that had driven her to desperate action, advocating for mental health intervention rather than just punishment. And they included him realizing that something had shifted during those hours of negotiation, during that moment when he'd touched her despite her threat, during the vulnerability she'd shown when she finally broke down. He'd started caring about her in ways that went beyond professional concern, and he had feeling, dangerous, complicated feeling, that she'd started caring about him too. This was going to be complicated. Burlum too. The aftermath of the hostage situation was predictably complicated. Vexara was arrested. You couldn't hold 3 people at weapon point for 8 hours without legal consequences, regardless of your motivations or mental state. But Daniel testified extensively on her behalf during preliminary hearings, explaining in detail the grief that had driven her actions, the systemic failures that had left her feeling she had no other options, the way station security had dismissed legitimate concerns about her brother's death without proper investigation. "This wasn't premeditated terrorism," Daniel told the judge during sentencing hearing. "This was desperate action by grieving sister who'd exhausted every legitimate avenue for justice and felt she had no choice but to force people to pay attention through extreme measures. She needs mental health intervention and support, not just punishment. Incarcerating her without addressing the grief and trauma underlying her actions serves no rehabilitative purpose. The judge, human woman with 30 years' experience in multi-species legal proceedings, listened carefully to Daniel's testimony and the psychiatric evaluations that confirmed Vexara was suffering from complicated grief and depression related to her brother's death and the system's failure to acknowledge her concerns. I'm assigning supervised release pending full trial, the judge decided. Ms. Vexara will undergo mandatory psychiatric treatment, will attend regular therapy sessions, and will be monitored by designated personnel to ensure she's not a continued threat. Given the unique rapport you apparently established during negotiation, Lieutenant Cross, I'm assigning you as her designated monitor. You'll be responsible for regular check-ins, ensuring she attends therapy, and reporting immediately if she shows signs of becoming dangerous again. This is highly irregular, but the psychiatric evaluators believe your continued involvement may be beneficial for her recovery. Are you willing to accept this responsibility? Daniel glanced at Vexara, who was watching him with expression he couldn't quite read. Yes, Your Honor, I'm willing. Then Ms. Vexara is remanded to supervised release under Lieutenant Cross's monitoring, with trial date set for 6 months from now pending her progress in treatment. Ms. Vexara, do you understand the conditions of your release? Yes, Vexara said quietly, still watching Daniel. So Daniel found himself responsible for Vexara's well-being and monitoring. They met 3 times weekly, combination of official monitoring, to ensure she wasn't threat and continuation of the rapport they'd built during those hours of negotiation. Sometimes they met in official therapy rooms station provided. Sometimes they just walked through public areas of the station, talking while maintaining the visibility that monitoring requirements demanded. Why did you do it? Vexara asked during one of their early monitoring sessions, sitting across from Daniel in the small but comfortable therapy room. During the standoff, when you put yourself between me and the hostage, you could have died. Why risk that? Because that's my job, Daniel said simply. Hostage negotiators accept risk to save lives. If I die preventing murder, that's acceptable trade-off in my profession. We're there specifically to put ourselves in danger so others don't have to be. But you touched me, Vexara said, and there was something in her voice beyond just recounting events. Something that sounded almost vulnerable. I said one more touch and I'd kill you. You smiled. I remember that smile, like you knew something I didn't, and you touched me anyway, twice. Once on my arm, once on my shoulder. Why? Daniel considered his answer carefully. Because I knew you wouldn't actually shoot me. The threat was desperation speaking, not genuine intent. Your body language, your tone, everything about the situation told me you were looking for excuse not to pull that trigger, not for justification to do it. And you needed, desperately needed, to know that someone cared enough about you to risk being wrong about that assessment. He leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes directly in a way Kethron culture considered respectful attention. Sometimes people need physical reassurance that they're not alone, especially when they're threatening violence to keep everyone at distance. You were hurting and isolated and convinced nobody cared. I needed to show you that wasn't true. That I cared enough to touch you even when you threatened to kill me for it. That you mattered enough to risk my life, demonstrating that you weren't alone in your grief. Kethron, don't touch casually, Vexara said quietly, looking down at her hands. Physical contact is reserved for family, very close friends, or combat. When you touched me while I held weapon pointed at you, that was either declaration of intimate friendship or acceptance of combat challenge. You chose friendship with someone actively threatening your life. That's. She struggled for words. That's incomprehensible by Kethron cultural standards, either insane courage or profound stupidity. Probably both, Daniel admitted with small smile. But it worked. You're alive, the hostages are safe. Your brother's case is being reopened. I'm personally making sure of that. Sometimes insane courage is necessary when conventional approaches have failed. They talked about Kethvar in depth during those sessions. Really talked, not just the brief information exchanged during the hostage situation. Vexara told Daniel about her brother's personality, his humor, his gentleness that was unusual among Kethron males, his dreams of bringing their mother to Unity Station once they'd saved enough money. She showed him pictures, holographic images of them together on their homeworld, of Kethvar in his maintenance uniform looking proud of his work. "He was my responsibility," Vexara said during one particularly emotional session. "In Kethron culture, elder sibling protects younger. Always. I brought him here. I told him it would be better than our homeworld, that humans would value his skills, that we'd build good life. And then he died because I couldn't protect him from humans who hated him for being alien taking their jobs. I failed my most fundamental duty as elder sister." "You couldn't have prevented equipment malfunction," Daniel said gently, though he was increasingly suspicious that it hadn't been simple malfunction. He'd started quietly investigating on his own time, following leads that official investigation had dismissed. "Equipment fails sometimes. That's not your fault." "Doesn't matter if it's logical," Vexara said. "Kethron honor doesn't care about logic. I was responsible for him. He died. I failed. That's why I needed justice. Because I couldn't save him, but I could at least ensure his death meant something, that it wasn't just forgotten accident that nobody cared about." Over weeks of sessions, their relationship developed beyond simple monitor and monitored. Daniel found himself looking forward to their meetings in ways that had nothing to do with professional obligation. Found himself thinking about her between sessions, wondering how she was coping, wanting to know more about her life and experiences and perspectives. And he was increasingly certain she felt similarly. The way her body language changed when he entered the room, less guarded, more open. The way she asked questions about his life outside work, showing genuine interest in who he was as person rather than just as negotiator or monitor. The way she'd started dressing more carefully for their sessions, not in obvious, trying to impress way, but in subtle attention to appearance that suggested she cared how he perceived her. "This is inappropriate," Daniel told himself firmly during his own therapy session. All negotiators were required to have therapists to process the trauma of their work. "She's in your care. There are power dynamics that make any romantic feelings problematic. You're supposed to be helping her heal, not developing attraction to her." "Do you think she feels the same way?" his therapist asked. "I think so, maybe. I'm not certain." Daniel ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "And that uncertainty makes it worse, because I don't know if I'm projecting or if there's genuine mutual attraction developing." "What would you do if you were certain she felt the same way?" "Nothing," Daniel said immediately. "Not while I'm her designated monitor. The power dynamics are too complicated. She's vulnerable, traumatized, dependent on my reports for her freedom. Acting on any attraction while I hold that authority over her would be unethical regardless of whether the feelings are mutual." "That's good answer," his therapist said. "Shows you're thinking about this appropriately. But what about after monitoring period ends? If you both still feel this way in 6 months when trial concludes and she's no longer under your supervision?" Daniel considered that. "Then maybe we could explore it, as equals without power dynamics complicating consent, if we both still want to after 6 months of appropriate boundaries." "That's reasonable approach," his therapist agreed. "Maintain professional boundaries now. See how you both feel when those boundaries can be removed. If the feelings persist without the intensity of crisis situation that brought you together, then they might be worth pursuing." Meanwhile, Daniel's investigation into Kethvar's death was producing disturbing results. The equipment that had failed was relatively new, only 6 months of service. Maintenance records showed it had been inspected and certified as functioning properly just 3 days before the catastrophic failure. But there were gaps in security footage from the maintenance area during the 48 hours preceding the accident. and 3 human workers who'd been documented harassing Kethvar in workplace complaints, complaints that had been filed but not acted upon, had all had access to that maintenance area during those gaps in surveillance. It wasn't proof. Daniel compiled everything he'd found and brought it to station security, insisting they look at it properly this time. And to their credit, when presented with actual evidence rather than grieving sister's suspicions, they reopened the investigation with more thorough approach. "You were right," Daniel told Vixara during their next session, "about your brother's death being more than accident. I found evidence suggesting equipment tampering. Security is investigating properly now. You might actually get justice." Vixara stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through relief, vindication, renewed grief, and something else Daniel couldn't quite identify. "You believed me," she finally said, "when nobody else did, when even other Kethron told me I was letting grief make me paranoid. You actually investigated and found evidence. Why?" "Because you deserve to be taken seriously," Daniel said. "Because your instincts were sound even if your methods were desperate. Because I care about you getting closure and peace, not just about monitoring you for threat assessment." "That's not complete answer," Vixara pressed, watching him with those intense Kethron eyes. "Tell me real reason, Daniel. Why do you care so much? This stopped being your job weeks ago. The standoff ended. I'm just monitoring assignment now. Why are you still investigating? Why do you care?" Daniel hesitated, knowing he was about to cross line into territory that was probably inappropriate given their current relationship. But Kethron valued honesty, and he was tired of hiding what he was feeling. "Because I care about you," he admitted. "Not just as negotiator or monitor, as person. I want you to have justice and closure. I want you to heal from your grief. I want you to build good life here despite everything that's happened. I care about your well-being in ways that go beyond my professional responsibilities. That's the truth." Vixara was quiet for a long moment, just watching him. Then, "That's inappropriate. You're my designated monitor. You hold authority over my freedom. You're supposed to maintain professional boundaries." "I know," Daniel said. "And I am maintaining them. I'm not acting on these feelings. I'm just acknowledging they exist because you asked for honesty. But I'm not pursuing anything while you're under my supervision. That would be abuse of the power dynamic between us." "But you want to," Vixara said. Not quite question, more like confirmation of what she was reading in his body language and tone. "If circumstances were different, if I wasn't your monitoring assignment, you'd want to pursue something." "Yes," Daniel admitted. "But circumstances aren't different, so I won't. I'll continue being professional monitor and friend who wants to help you heal, nothing more. Not while the power dynamics are what they are." "What if I told you I feel the same way?" Vixara asked quietly. "That I've developed feelings that aren't appropriate given our relationship. That I tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself it was just gratitude for saving my life and helping with investigation. But it's more than that. What would you say?" Daniel's heart was pounding. "I'd say we wait until monitoring period ends, until you're legally free of my supervision, until we can meet as equals without power dynamics or professional ethics complicating consent. Then if we both still feel this way, we explore it properly. Can you accept that?" "Kethron aren't patient," Vixara said, but there was hint of smile. "We want what we want and we pursue it directly. Waiting goes against every instinct. But you're willing to wait." "Yes," Vixara said. "Because you're right about power dynamics. Because rushing this while you hold authority over my freedom would taint whatever we might build together. Because I want this to be clean and real when it happens, not complicated by questions about whether my feelings are genuine or just response to you having power over me. I'll wait. We'll both wait. And then we'll see if these feelings survive outside crisis and monitoring contexts." 3 months until her trial and the end of monitoring period. 3 months of maintaining professional boundaries while being acutely aware of mutual attraction they'd acknowledged but couldn't act on. It was going to be the longest 3 months of Daniel's life. But it was the right thing to do. And if the feelings lasted, if they could build something real from this complicated beginning, it would be worth the wait. The 3 months of waiting were simultaneously easier and more difficult than Daniel had anticipated. Easier because they'd acknowledged the attraction and agreed on boundaries, removing ambiguity and constant wondering about whether feelings were mutual. More difficult because every session was exercise in restraint, in maintaining professional distance when both of them wanted to close that distance, in careful avoidance of any touch beyond what was professionally appropriate. They continued regular monitoring sessions because they were required. 3 times weekly, Daniel met with Vexara to discuss her therapy progress, her emotional state, whether she was showing any signs of becoming dangerous again. She never did. The grief was still there, but she was processing it more healthily with her therapist, channeling her energy into cooperating with the renewed investigation into her brother's death rather than into destructive action. But the sessions also became something more than monitoring. They talked about everything, not just her grief and recovery, but their families, their interests, their hopes and fears, and the experiences that had shaped them into who they were. Getting to know each other as complete people rather than just negotiator and subject. Building genuine friendship alongside the attraction they'd acknowledged but couldn't act on yet. "Tell me about your family," Vexara asked during one session. They were in one of the station's observation lounges, watching stars drift past through the massive viewport while maintaining the visibility that monitoring requirements demanded. "My parents are both still alive, living in Midwest region of North America on Earth," Daniel said. "Father's a teacher, mother works in agriculture. I have 2 younger sisters, both married with children. Very normal, stable family. Nothing dramatic or traumatic in my background that drove me to hostage negotiation." "Then why did you choose this work?" Vexara asked. "It's dangerous and emotionally difficult. Most humans avoid careers that involve regular risk of death." "Because I'm good at it," Daniel said simply. "I have natural empathy, ability to read people and understand what drives them, patience to talk through crisis instead of rushing to force solutions. And because I believe in giving people chances to make better choices. Most people in crisis situations aren't evil. They're desperate or frightened or backed into corners they can't see their way out of. I like being the person who helps them see those ways out. Like you did for me," Vexara observed. "Like I did for you," Daniel agreed. "You weren't terrorist or monster. You were grieving sister who'd exhausted legitimate options and felt she had no choice but desperate action. You deserved someone who'd listen and help rather than just treating you as threat to eliminate." "I could have killed you," Vexara said quietly. "So easily. When you touched me despite my threat, if my aim had wavered even slightly from emotion or exhaustion, I could have shot you accidentally. Weren't you terrified?" "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I was absolutely terrified, but I was more concerned about you than afraid of you. Fear for your well-being outweighed fear of you harming me. That's when you know someone matters to you, when their safety becomes more important than your own." Vexara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Kethron relationships are intense when we commit. We don't do casual or gradual the way humans often do. If we pursue this after monitoring ends, I'll be pursuing it with full commitment. That might be overwhelming for human used to more measured approach." "And I'm negotiator by profession," Daniel countered. "Which means I'll want to talk through everything, process emotions verbally, negotiate boundaries and expectations explicitly. That might be exhausting for Kethron, who prefers direct action to extended discussion. We're going to have to find balance between our natural approaches." "We will," Vexara said with confidence. "We survived hostage standoff together. We can survive relationship complications." Daniel's investigation continued bearing fruit. Station security's renewed investigation found evidence that supported suspicions of sabotage. Microscopic tool marks on the failed pressure seal that suggested deliberate tampering. Testimony from Kethron workers who'd seen the 3 human suspects near the maintenance area during times they shouldn't have been there. Recovered communications between the suspects discussing their resentment of aliens taking human jobs. It still wasn't perfect case. Much of evidence was circumstantial, and the suspects were claiming innocence. But it was enough to bring charges, enough to demonstrate that Kethvar's death hadn't been simple accident, enough to give Vexara the validation she'd been seeking that her instincts had been correct. "Thank you," she told Daniel when he brought her updates on investigation's progress. "For believing me, for caring enough to investigate when it wasn't your job, for giving my brother justice he deserved. This means more than I can express." "You fought for it first," Daniel pointed out. "You put yourself at enormous risk to force people to care. I just followed the path you started. Your courage made this possible." "My reckless desperation made this possible," Vexara corrected. "Let's be honest about what drove that standoff. But yes, I fought. And you helped me fight more effectively. We make good team." The trial date approached. The prosecution against the 3 suspects was proceeding, slowly, with complications but proceeding. Vexara's own trial for the hostage situation was scheduled, though her lawyer was confident that given circumstances and her cooperation during monitoring period, she'd receive suspended sentence with time served and continued therapy requirements rather than incarceration. And the monitoring period was ending. 6 months of careful professional boundaries, of building friendship while being acutely aware of mutual attraction they couldn't act on, of learning each other while maintaining appropriate distance. It was almost over. Soon they'd be free to explore what they'd both acknowledged they wanted. "One more week," Vexara said during their second-to-last monitoring session. "Then you're no longer my monitor. Then we can finally stop pretending this is purely professional relationship." "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked. "Terrified," Vexara admitted. "What if the attraction doesn't survive outside monitoring context? What if we only feel this way because of crisis intensity and forced proximity? What if we try relationship and discover we're incompatible in ways friendship can hide?" "All valid concerns," Daniel acknowledged. "But the only way to answer them is to try. We've both acknowledged we want to. We've waited appropriately to ensure power dynamics don't complicate consent. Now we see if what we've built can become something more." Her trial came first. Daniel testified again, explaining her mental state during standoff, her cooperation during monitoring, the progress she'd made in therapy. The judge ruled as her lawyer had predicted: suspended sentence with time served, continued therapy requirements, but no incarceration given her demonstrated progress and the extenuating circumstances of grief and systemic failure that had driven her actions. "You're free," Daniel told her after sentencing. "Legally free, with no more monitoring requirements. I'm no longer your designated supervisor. We're just 2 people who went through intense situation together and came out the other side. Now we decide what we want to do with that." Vexara looked at him with those intense Kethron eyes. "I want dinner. Actual date, not monitoring session disguised as meal. Private booth where we can talk freely without documentation requirements. Just us, exploring whether this attraction we've been carefully not acting on for 6 months is real or just artifact of crisis situation. Do you want that too?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "Let me take you to dinner, proper first date. We'll see where it leads." He took her to a small restaurant that specialized in multi-species cuisine, private booth in back where they could talk without being overheard. It was first time they'd been alone together without monitoring requirements. First time they could touch casually without professional ethics concerns. First time they could just be themselves without roles defining their interaction. "We made it," Vexara said, smiling genuinely for first time in months. 6 months of appropriate professional distance, 3 months of acknowledged attraction we couldn't act on. Now we can finally stop being careful and be honest about what we want. What do you want? Daniel asked, reaching across table to take her hand. It was first time he'd touched her since that day in Cargo Bay when he'd touched her twice despite her threat, and the contact sent electricity through him that confirmed feelings had survived the wait. I want to know you outside crisis context, Vixara said. I want to see if what we've built can become partnership. I want to explore this attraction without monitoring requirements hanging over us. I want to see if you're as brave and compassionate in normal life as you were when I had weapon pointed at you. I want to know if I can love you the way I think I'm already starting to. I want all of that too, Daniel said. And I want to know if you're as strong and intelligent in peace as you were in crisis. If your directness and honesty translate to healthy relationship communication. If we can build something real from this complicated beginning. If what started with you threatening to kill me and me touching you anyway can become genuine love. They talked for hours, not about monitoring or investigations or grief, but about everything else. Their childhoods, their favorite foods, their hobbies and interests and dreams for future. Getting to know each other as potential romantic partners rather than negotiator and subject. Building foundation for relationship that might become something lasting. I should warn you, Vixara said at one point, her hand still in his across the table. Kethron physical intimacy is intense. We're passionate species. If we progress to that, it might be overwhelming for human use to more restrained approach. And I should warn you, Daniel countered with smile, that I'll want to talk through boundaries and preferences explicitly before attempting anything physical. Negotiator trait. Wanting to ensure everyone's needs and limits are clearly understood. That might seem clinical for Kethron used to more spontaneous approach. We'll figure it out, Vixara said confidently. Communication and compromise. That's how cross-species relationships work. We both adjust to meet each other's needs. One more thing, Daniel said seriously. About that day in Cargo Bay, when I touched you despite your threat, I need you to know I was absolutely terrified I might be wrong about you. That you might actually shoot me. But I touched you anyway because you mattered more than my fear. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand. When I commit to something or someone, I commit completely, even when it's frightening, even when it's risky. If we do this, if we build relationship, I'm all in. I need to know you understand that. Vixara squeezed his hand. I understand, and I'm the same. Kethron don't do anything halfway. If we build this relationship, I commit fully. We're both all in or we're nothing. No half measures, no holding back. That's how we survive complications, by being completely honest and completely committed. I can do that. Can you? Yes, Daniel said. I can do that. They weren't wrong about complications. Cross-species relationships were inherently complex, and theirs had additional layers of unusual origin story, lingering trauma from the standoff, and the ongoing investigation into Kethvar's death that kept reminding them both of what had brought them together. But they navigated complications with honest communication that had characterized their monitoring sessions, and now defined their relationship. The investigation into Kethvar's death eventually produced enough evidence for conviction. All three defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide, not murder in first degree, because prosecution couldn't prove specific intent to kill, but enough to acknowledge that their sabotage of equipment had directly caused his death. They received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years, and Station implemented new oversight procedures for equipment maintenance and workplace harassment reporting to prevent similar situations. It didn't bring Kethvar back. Nothing could do that. But it gave Vixara closure, knowledge that her instincts had been correct, that she hadn't failed her brother by being unable to prevent accident, that his death meant something because it exposed systemic problems and led to reforms that would protect other alien workers. Thank you, she told Daniel after verdicts came in. They were in his quarters. She'd been spending increasing amounts of time there as their relationship deepened, until they were essentially living together even if she still officially maintained separate residence. For believing me when nobody else did, for investigating when it wasn't your job, for giving my brother justice, for saving me from destroying myself in pursuit of that justice, for everything. You did the hard part, Daniel said, pulling her close. You fought for justice when everyone told you to accept convenient lie. You risked everything to force people to care. I just helped channel that courage more constructively. Your brother would be proud of you. Their relationship deepened over following months, learning each other's cultures with patience and humor, navigating biological differences that made some aspects of human Kethron intimacy challenging, dealing with judgment from both species who thought cross-species relationships were mistakes doomed to fail. Vixara taught Daniel about Kethron culture, honor codes that governed behavior, combat traditions that seemed violent to humans, but were actually highly regulated and ritualistic family structures that emphasized sibling bonds more than parent-child relationships. She showed him Kethron courtship customs, teaching him the significance of certain gestures and gifts that carried meaning in her culture. Daniel taught her about human emotional expression, the ways humans processed feelings through talking rather than action, the indirect communication styles that frustrated her, but that he explained as cultural framework she needed to understand if she wanted to build life in human-dominated space. He showed her human romance traditions, explaining why certain gestures that seemed meaningless to her actually carried significant emotional weight for humans. Physical intimacy, when they progressed to it, required communication and creativity and patience from both of them. Kethron and human bodies were similar enough to make intimacy possible, but different enough to require adjustment and adaptation. They figured it out through experimentation and lots of talking and occasional moments of awkwardness that they learned to laugh about rather than let discourage them. You're very patient, Vixara observed after one particularly successful intimate encounter. You care about my experience, not just your own satisfaction. That's not universal trait even among Kethron partners. I appreciate it. And you're very direct about what you want, Daniel responded, pulling her closer in the afterglow. You tell me immediately if something isn't working or if you need different approach. That makes it so much easier to actually satisfy you when you give clear feedback instead of expecting me to guess. I appreciate that. We're good together, Vixara said contentedly. Better than I expected. Better than either of us probably deserved given how we met. Do you regret it? Daniel asked. How we met, the standoff and everything that came after. No, Vixara said firmly. It was worst moment of my life in many ways. Losing control, threatening innocent people, coming so close to destroying myself. But it brought you into my life. It forced me to confront my grief instead of letting it consume me. It gave my brother's death meaning through the investigation and reforms that followed. I wish none of it had been necessary, but I don't regret that it led to you, to us, to this. They formalized their partnership about a year into their relationship. Combination of human civil partnership ceremony and Kethron bonding ritual that involved blood oaths and honor declarations that made Daniel distinctly nervous, but that Vixara insisted were important for her cultural identity and for their relationship to be recognized as legitimate among her people. You're sure about this? Daniel asked the night before ceremony. Kethron bonding is permanent in ways human marriage often isn't. You're committing for life, not just until it stops being convenient. I'm sure, Vixara said. Kethron don't commit casually. When we bond, it's forever. That's what I want with you. Permanent partnership that survives complications and difficulties. Forever, Daniel, that's what I'm choosing. Then forever it is, Daniel agreed. Permanent partnership. You and me. I'm all in. Their colleagues got used to them. The human negotiator and the Kethron warrior who'd met during hostage standoff and somehow built lasting relationship from that violent beginning. They became story told to new station personnel. example of how even worst situations could lead to unexpected positive outcomes if people were brave enough to reach across divides with compassion, instead of just meeting violence with force. Do people ever ask about the touching? Vexara wondered one evening while they were relaxing at home. About that moment when I said one more touch and I'd kill you, and you smiled and touched me twice anyway. All the time, Daniel said. Everyone wants to know if I was actually that confident or just insane. What do you tell them? That I was both. Confident that you weren't actually killer despite circumstances, but also completely insane to bet my life on that assessment. Best gamble I ever made, though, led to this, led to you. I almost shot you, Vexara confessed. For about half-second after that second touch, I almost pulled trigger. Not because I wanted to kill you, but because Kethron honor demanded I follow through on threat. But I couldn't. Your touch was so clearly compassionate, so obviously gentle despite danger I represented. You weren't attacking or dominating, you were comforting. And I needed that comfort so desperately that I couldn't reject it even to preserve my threat. That's when I started falling in love with you, even though I didn't recognize it at the time. I fell in love with you when you finally let yourself break, Daniel said. When the weapon dropped and you collapsed and trusted me to catch you. When you let yourself be vulnerable instead of maintaining warrior strength. That vulnerability in face of everything you'd been through, that's when I knew you were extraordinary. That's when I knew I wanted to be person you trusted with that vulnerability. Years passed. They built life together on Unity Station, both continuing their careers. Daniel still negotiating hostage situations with even better understanding of how grief and desperation could drive violence. Vexara becoming advocate for alien workers' rights and helping prevent situations like her brother's death from recurring. They became mentors for other cross-species couples navigating complications of building relationships across biological and cultural divides. We made something good from tragedy, Vexara observed during one of their quiet evenings at home, curled together watching stars drift past their quarters viewport. Kethvar's death led to safety reforms. My hostage situation led to better mental health support for grieving aliens. Our relationship proved that even enemies can become life partners with enough courage and communication. He'd be proud of what came from his death, proud that it meant something beyond just loss. He'd be proud of you, Daniel corrected gently, for fighting for justice even when system failed you, for channeling your grief into advocacy instead of letting it destroy you, for building life worth living despite everything, for becoming person who helps others instead of person consumed by revenge. That's what he'd care about, that you survived and thrived. He'd like you too, Vexara said with certainty, for saving me when I couldn't save myself, for giving me reason to keep living when I wanted to die with honor, for being human brave enough to touch armed Kethron warrior who threatened to kill you, because you cared more about my pain than your own safety, for loving me despite complications. He'd be grateful to you for taking care of his sister, and surrounded by the life they'd built from worst moment of both their lives. They proved that sometimes courage meant touching someone who threatened violence, that sometimes love grew from hostility, when someone was brave enough to see pain beneath fury, and that sometimes the best relationships began with someone saying, "One more touch and I'll kill you," and someone else smiling and touching them anyway, twice, because compassion mattered more than self-preservation, because vulnerability needed acknowledgement even when wrapped in threats, because sometimes the most important thing you could do was show someone in pain that they weren't alone, even if demonstrating that could cost you everything. That moment in cargo bay, one more touch and I'll kill you, followed by smile and two deliberate touches that chose trust over fear, remained foundation of everything they built together. Reminder that courage sometimes meant breaking through barriers people erected in desperation, that compassion could transform violence into vulnerability, that touching someone at their most dangerous could lead to touching them at their most tender, that enemies could become beloved partners if someone was brave enough to reach across divides with open heart and gentle hands. They told the story often, to friends, to colleagues, to other cross-species couples facing their own complications. The story of how hostage standoff became love story, how threat of death became declaration of life, how one insane moment of touching when touch was forbidden became foundation for partnership that lasted lifetimes. Would you do it again? People asked Daniel. Knowing how it turned out, would you still touch her when she threatened to kill you? Every single time, he always answered. That moment changed everything. Showed her she mattered enough for someone to risk death demonstrating they cared. Showed me she was worth saving, worth loving, worth building life with. Best decision I ever made. Touching when I should have retreated, trusting when I should have feared, choosing compassion when everyone else would have chosen force. That's how you build love from violence. That's how you transform enemies into family. You reach out anyway. You touch despite threats. You trust that vulnerability will answer vulnerability. And sometimes you're wrong and you die. But sometimes you're right and you get everything.